Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and I'm here with Reed Hepler, and we're talking about this week in AI, but it's actually these last 2 weeks in AI because Reed has been on vacation. It is Friday, August 9th, 2024. And Reed, you came back from being away, and I said there's just a gazillion new stories. So we're not going to cover the individual stories, but we thought we'd pull some themes out of them.
Mm-hmm.
Can I start with a few quotes? These are
Yep.
from articles that I read.
Mhm.
This was about prompt engineering, and one thing that you and I have said kind of over and over again is it's good to know prompt engineering, but it's going to go away.
Yeah.
The AI is going to get better, and it's going to get incorporated into other products. So this was a good article, and that says the longest study. Oops, that's the wrong quote. AI. This is from a Medium article. AI isn't going to be limited to the frailty of humans and their poorly worded prompts. It is already learning those tools and improving on them. So, what human AI skill is going to withstand the test of time? What's our enduring power tool in the AI age? Problem formulation. I thought that was really brilliantly said. That was Don Giannatti. Thoughts on that, Reed?
Well, it reminds me directly of one of my favorite quotes from iRobot in the end, because I like my science fiction, where it talks about how the machines are built to analyze data and they're built to, give suggestions and control the human product. And this is an age where machines are telling all humanity what to do. But and this is kind of important. They say the human role has been what it always has been, which is discovering new data to be analyzed and new problems to be solved. So even in the 50s and 60s, Isaac Asimov saw that no matter what robots can do or what AI to or what machines can do, they can't solve problems and they can't make priority decisions. They can, it's humans' responsibility to actually take what the robots say or what the AI says and apply it into the world, because AI can't do that. So, yeah.
Good thoughts. My next quote is from Ethan Mollick. This is from a July 4th article, and he's talking about the name of his article, Substack article it's not, it's from One Useful Thing. Yeah, that is Substack. The article's title is Gradually, Then Suddenly, Upon the Threshold. And he says, until something happens, it's worth contemplating the concluding lines to OpenAI's new paper on using AI to debug AI code. From this point on, the intelligence of large language models will only continue to improve. Human intelligence will not. Thoughts?
It's interesting to think that you always think that human, I mean, there's always new things we can learn, but it I'll have to ponder on that thought. Ethan Mock is always a really good thought
I know.
leader in terms of AI, and he always says things you have to take a few minutes to think about, like, what does that mean? So I'll have to think about that. But that's a really good, and that was just from his blog post.
Yeah, July 4th, gradually, then
Okay.
suddenly upon the threshold.
Okay.
Okay, so then the last quote I wanted to talk about comes from an article in Every, and it is titled The Horny Truth About AI Chatbots. And this article is really worth reading. It talks a lot about the use of large language models to be, for some years now, to be companions, intimate companions, and therapeutic companions. And the quote is, um, because people have reported very positive results from these experiences with uh, artificial intelligence companions. The longest study only measured those feelings over a week. The article's author, and that is Evan Armstrong, says, my intuition says that using these chatbots to solve loneliness is the equivalent of using a GLP-1 drug to solve weight issues. Sure, you get the outcome, but without the underlying lifestyle changes, you are ultimately reliant on a product that has unknown long-term effects. And I thought the article was brilliant in two ways. One of which was it describes both the financial and the numeric success of these programs that provide companionship, and describes through interviews with some of the users the degree to which even up to 10 plus hours a day people are using these um, language model companions to talk problems through, to get advice and the like. Even in the most intimate of problems, asking the large language model for advice and being very dependent on it. It's the conclusion I came to was this is inevitable.
Yeah.
You know, I think you and I talked about this a lot with the Sky voice model from ChatGPT 4.0. It's just too triggering on a Darwinian emotional level
Uh-huh.
for us not to feel some emotion related to the conversation. And this does go back to the Eliza effect,
Uh-huh.
which was the name of the program. I don't know if you know the date. I don't know it offhand, but I think it was in the early 1960s where they
Yes.
had a computer program that gave responses to mimic a therapist. It was very rudimentary,
Yes.
but even in that rudimentary way of repeating back what people had said, and I'm sure this was done by text, the people actually thought there might be a person behind it, and
Yeah.
began to
Uh-huh.
develop a level of trust and um, intimacy with the program. So maybe intimacy is the wrong word, but a sense of trust with the
Yeah.
program. So this Eliza effect, I think, is very real. And one of the concerns that comes out of the news, and let's shift to the news, is that with the barrage of stories this week about sort of disappointment in AI, or inflated expectations, the bubble kind of bursting, or even the financial bubble bursting related to AI, that these companies will need to seek for profitable ventures. And this is likely to be an area where people will pay. They'll pay for that kind of companionship and association. Thoughts?
It's interesting. I mean, um, well, uh, I don't know if you've watched Young Sheldon at all, but in Young Sheldon, he actually downloads Eliza and talks to it. And then about four responses later into the conversation, it shuts down. It's like, I can't handle this. And he's like, what? It's shutting down? I thought it was my friend. And even just in four messages, he'd become emotionally invested. And so I think that's really, I don't know if they obviously, because this was in like 2019, but so they couldn't have known what was going to happen. But it was just interesting that they decided we're going to have this happen, and it's an illustration point. I did read earlier. You sent that to me, the the chatbot conversation intimacy article, and it was interesting to think that people don't think through these things. Like the whole message of the article was take a minute and realize that it's not a human you're talking to. Take a minute and realize that you need to have relationships with people. And people just don't understand that, I think. They're perfectly content with not having human interactions as long as they can have interactions with something else that will get the job done. It's kind of disturbing a little bit to me. But I mean, I suppose from a logistical, from a, purely um, impersonal standpoint, if that's what they need to be productive, and if they don't need human interaction, then that's okay. I mean, it's what suits them. But I just couldn't imagine not having any human interaction. That would just be bizarre. But they're approaching that, and as like with the what the Ethan Mollick paper said, that AI intelligence is expanding and human intelligence allegedly will not. I wonder if the same is true for AI um, intimacy, that more and more people are going to go to that. Who knows? But
Yeah. I mean, I remain convinced that the reason that there haven't been in the last 10 years any really good sort of groundbreaking works on personality typing and temperament and the internet is because that data is so valuable. Building the psychographic profile of us means that they can market to us. And it's hard to imagine that there isn't an enormous amount of detailed work going into understanding how large language models can respond to people in ways that they like, that helps them feel good, and that information is going to be gold. The problem is, I remember when social media came out, and I had some friends that I grew up with. I grew up in Palo Alto, and some of them worked at large tech companies. And I remember hearing quotes from them like, you know, my kid is not going to get a cell phone until he's a certain age, and they're going to Montessori schools. And it was like
Yeah.
they knew they were building something. It
Uh-huh.
was not healthy, but it was profitable. So there is a sort of a double bind kind of a thing going on here where we may not like the technology, but it's profitable and someone's going to do it. So we might as well be the ones to do it. And I
Yeah.
think this goes on quite a bit. So, your question about do we don't understand? Well, part of what I think is happening is we're beginning to realize that we've conceived of the human mind as being this largely rational kind of thinking machine.
Hmm.
And what I think large language models are reminding us of is that that's not actually the case.
Uh-huh.
And if you believe in evolutionary psychology, you're likely to think, okay, well, our intelligence evolved for social purposes, not for double-blind studies and the truth, right? That we have to work really hard to discipline ourselves to think with that kind of rationality and logic. That there are all these other ways in which we respond and react that are related to other things. So I am kind of interested in the way in which we're learning about ourselves because of AI, and being realistic that if you put a very sexy looking avatar with a
Hmm.
sultry voice that knows you well, it's going to be really hard to resist talking to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, uh, our ability to navigate those waters feels limited. Like I
Well, and
think
it's
we,
interesting because the OpenAI just barely released that ultra new voice, or what do they call it? I think they call it. Do they call it ultra voice or mega voice or something? I haven't tested it out. It sounds kind of strange. I don't even know if I have access to it. But that seems to be the next step of having, holographic or at least video interactions. Because you went to text interactions and then voice interactions and now supercharged voice interactions, whatever that means. And now it could graduate to video
yeah,
interactions.
and you put that in a robot body, and I just candidly, it's going to the article about uh, the horny side of AI. Candidly, that's going to be attractive to a lot of people,
Mhm.
right? Because if
Yeah.
you struggle socially and you don't have, you don't feel like you're making connections with people, you know, uh, it will trigger innate feelings within us, whether or not we think that's smart or rational or logical. It will trigger it. Okay, so quickly moving forward, I think we talked a little bit about the Biden and Trump information that large language models are willing to discuss,
Mhm.
or withholding. And I think for me, that was just a reminder that these are not entirely objective, rational data machines.
No.
There are humans behind them who are creating algorithms and prompting the models to respond in certain ways that indicate that the desires or beliefs of the people who are in charge of the program are wanting to shape the information that you get.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because you had some of the AIs who were saying I don't want to talk about this. Some of them, like Google Gemini, uh, denied that Trump was shot, and then it refused to talk about the Biden-Harris transfer in the Democratic Party, and so it's just different models have different responses, and then it kind of shows that they're not perfect. And of course, every human has a different perspective on what happened and what's the best thing climbing after AIs. But it's interesting that they will not give a definitive answer, and they haven't all been trained the same way, evidently, or maybe they've just been trained differently, but they have similar answers or similar results because of other things. Could be anything. But in any case, they're not objective; they're subjective. So
Yeah, we
yeah.
talked a lot about this in the boot camp. You and I both feel really good about how the boot camp ended up, the productivity boot camp, because I think we said some things that have proven to be very accurate.
Mhm.
One of which is that AIs are biased.
Yeah.
They're built on the material of a culture, so they have a bias related to the inherent bias of the culture. and then they're also shaped afterwards to provide or not provide certain responses, and that we are biased. And so when it's seeking rapport with us, it often will do a confirmation bias and tell us the things that we want to hear. And so we have to be careful. We have to be very careful about the information we get from these large language models. They're not robots. They are language models.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I mean, I mean, granted, I was talking about the novel I, Robot, but even I slipped up and called them robots, and it's easy to think of them in anthropomorphized terms. But it related to that, and and miscommunication and our misunderstanding, it's easy to have inflated expectations and expect them to be more productive than we are, expect them to do all these things, and sometimes, kind of like we were talking about, how they're trained to make you feel good. They may lie and say they can do something and then they can't. Or in one case, they lied and said they couldn't do something, and I'm like, oh no, you can. I'm like, oh, sorry, yes, I can, and then it did it. So you have to know for yourself, and that's kind of what I think the message of the boot camp was you need to know for yourself what they can do. You need to have the confidence to experiment with it, and don't listen to what other people say about their abilities. Figure them out for yourself.
Yeah.
So it was really
We
interesting.
discussed a lot the financial motivations for exaggerating the capacity of AI tools to do certain things. And we use this idea of a toolbox, that you find a tool that will actually do something productive for you. Like it could be Grammarly or Ideogram, or for me, it's Perplexity. And you use that tool to be productive in a certain area, but don't believe there's a magic wand that you're just going to be able to sit down and it's going to do all of the work for you.
Yeah.
I think the time will be kind to us in terms of the messaging we gave at the boot camp.
Mhm.
Um, okay, so the inflated expectations stories, there were many of them. They relate, I think, a little bit to the stock market fluctuations, concerns that there's an enormous amount of money being spent, and there was one really good article that it's just not creating productivity that people thought. Now, it's definitely displacing people in jobs.
Yes.
So there's
Yes.
certain sectors where there are jobs that are going away because they're being replaced by the coding capability or other financial analysis competency of the artificial intelligence. But by and large, those who are using it in the workplace are reporting that they don't feel more productive for using AI. And we're even seeing some, teachers and educators say that they're not going to allow the students to use AI because they want them to learn the core skills before they actually use the tool.
Mhm.
So, kind of a shift in perspective right now,
Yeah.
a cultural shift. Um, we talked about intimate conversations and therapy and a lot of therapeutic uses. And we'll probably drill down on that at some other point in time. But again, a continued sense that this is potentially a good therapeutic tool, but with some dangers. Several sort of high-profile departures from OpenAI. So this was not the couple of weeks of positive news for OpenAI. There's the hint that they're releasing, or they have released a new version of the chatbot, which has the code name Strawberry, which I think previously was codenamed Q, and that this is going to represent a shift in reasoning capability and the like. And I would say my personal take is, as much as I like to be a realist about what AI can currently do, and that it overpromises and it's not a good news source and the like, that they're going to figure some of these things out. And I also personally believe that there will be a cascade effect, that as they begin to figure this out, it will happen more and more quickly, and that we do need to wonder, when we're in the least intelligent thinking process in the room, what does that mean? Is it a fulfillment of all of those sci-fi stories? How do we actually harness something that appears to be potentially smarter than us?
Yeah. It's interesting to just kind of ponder our place in the world a little bit. Not that it's really an existential threat, but it's definitely it appears to be a cognitive threat, or like a reasoning threat. And so it's just yeah, it's kind of scary. Kind of like what Ethan Malik was saying, you have to have at least three sleepless nights, or like you say, I think you said, I like to say three conversations. What was it?
Well,
With
I felt the same way. The three
oh,
sleepless nights
okay.
for me, for sure.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Well, I guess there is. Um, well, let's move on because
Okay.
we've got we want to be time wise be careful about it. Okay, so
Right.
we want to do a little bit of a deep dive.
Okay.
Um, the over the last couple of weeks. One thing worth saying though is it does feel like OpenAI has been pushing back the time frame for AGI and a artificial super intelligence, right?
Okay.
So general
Yeah.
intelligence, and I've wondered, I don't have any evidence for this, but I've wondered if there is a concern that things are happening too fast and it will be hard for people to absorb.
Mm.
And so the idea that we might see AGI next year or superintelligence within a couple of years was scary enough that people are saying, hey, we need to tone this language back because it's not helpful to people for us to be sounding like it's imminent. Okay, so my personal experience with AI in the last 2 weeks, aside from all the news stories, has never been greater. My personal productivity is has seen dramatic shifts, and I'll mention a couple of ways. So I'm a Chromebook user. I have Chromebook tablets, and so I have the benefit of being able to use both Android and traditional Chrome on a device at the same time. And in both cases, in Android and in Chrome, I can now go to a YouTube video and get a summary of it rather than watching the whole 40 minutes or 2 hours or 3 hours of the video and then decide how much I want to drill down. I can go to any web page and get a summary of the article before I decide if I'm going to dive deep into the article. Part of the reason there's such an enormous number of articles in the blog, the news blog for futureofai.org these last 2 weeks has been that I can get through a lot more articles than I ever could.
Mhm.
Instead of bookmarking them to read later, I can actually do the summary and then I decide which ones I want to read in full and which ones I don't.
Mhm.
So my personal use of AI has increased and my productivity because of it has increased. So again, I wouldn't have been able to tell you a year ago that summarizing of YouTube videos and articles was going to be the thing for me this
Uh-huh.
summer, but it clearly is. And
Yeah.
Perplexity is unique for me
Mhm.
because both in terms of its output, which feels much more objective than the other chatbots, but also that it shows you what it's doing while it's doing it. It gives you the questions it's researching first to get to the ultimate conclusion. It tells you what sources it's looking at. This is a kind of an amazing thing. This is what I wanted um, chatbots to be. It
Well,
is
and it's
much more.
giving you the link to the sources too. It's not just telling you what source. It's like, here, go and verify this yourself. So that's kind of cool.
No, absolutely, super helpful to me. Um, okay, and we do have a document called Framework Principles for the Use of AI, which we
Mhm.
we kind of built doing the productivity boot camp. But it feels like this idea of reasonable expectations, there isn't a magic wand, and focusing on the practical, pragmatic, and applicable really are good ways to think about AI right now.
Mhm.
Look for ways in which it's actually going to help you and benefit you, and use it. Um, okay, so what do you want to do for the deep dive next?
So we have well, we have those framework principles, and I'm going to talk about kind of the AI over-promising things. The framework is really helpful, but the main thing that I learned, and the main thing that's like within half of these framework principles, we're talking about language, not logic. AI is biased. Focus on the approach, not the tool. It's all about keeping your mindset and keeping your mind open and being aware of things. And we need to be honest with ourselves about what AI can do and what AI can't do. And this was right before I went on vacation on July 24th. I wrote an article called "What Would Carl Sagan Think About Generative AI?" because I love Carl Sagan, and it focuses kind of on the skepticism that he has about the AI tools and about, or well, just in general, and how one might apply that skepticism to AI tools. Um, because OpenAI specifically and other AI companies, but have kind of talked about all the things that they can do. I remember with the Rabbit R1 AI agent, like the little handheld $200 thing, was going to do all sorts of things, and then it didn't deliver on half of them. And so, but we also have things like the AI carbon footprint. that kind of people didn't really talk about until people were forced to talk about it. And so there's a lot of things whereas like with carbon footprints, business productivity, education, there's a huge pushback from education right now of AI is not going to revolutionize this. Just, what is the real impact of AI versus what is not? So um, it's interesting to think about that. And we've talked a little bit about the AI over promising, but um, what do you, I guess we in the last session of the boot camp, we talked about, the AI revolution is going to happen versus it's not going to happen. With these past 2 weeks of news articles, do you think it's still going to happen, or how might that change? How might the AI revolution be changing?
Yeah, certainly I think there's a little bit of cold water being poured on the overhyped aspects of it. I still think that there are ways in which AI is the revolution of my personal life, up
Uh-huh.
there with the internet in terms of my engagement and my excitement about learning. Um, just the ability to put now this is a tricky area, right? But
Yeah.
I can create a custom GPT, or that's for ChatGPT, or there are other forms and other products. But I can I can upload source documents, PDF or text files that are specific, and then I can query just based on that material. So that has
Uh-huh.
great business application for policy manuals or information about a company or a product or whatever else. Again, for our purposes, there are questions of copyright and what material am I do I if I have a PDF, is it a legitimate PDF? Have I paid for it? Is it copy protected? I have to be very careful about this. So I sort of feel like for my personal use, where I've bought a book and I have the PDF version of it, I can put it in there, or
Mhm.
it's in the public domain. But I've taken works of certain thinkers, like you might have taken Carl Sagan's point of view, but I could take all of the body of work that you have that's in printed form, put it into a custom GPT, and have a conversation with it,
Mhm.
and then say, oh, and if this person who's represented by that body of work were to be talking to this other thinker, where would they agree and where would they disagree? These are things
Yeah.
I've wanted to do forever. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think there are very real issues that you and I have identified of whether, what a large language model can actually do. And just because we have been overpromising and people don't have a good sense of what it's actually doing, doesn't mean it's not super valuable.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Uh-huh.
we didn't talk about the articles about using the improved use cases of AI, where it's fed specific medical databases and its ability to actually give good medical information back. And they did very rigorous testing, where they would give a prompt, and then they would actually, each prompt, they would go and research what information the AI gave back and how it matched the actual existing medical information. To me, very clearly, it's going to be a game changer for medicine,
Well,
because
and
it
one
will be
of
able to track everything.
uh-huh. Well, and one of the things that kind of jumped out to me when you were talking about your use cases and the medical use cases, and a lot of the thought leaders in education on LinkedIn, on their institutions' websites, they're talking about use cases that are human-centered, and they're what humans want to do, and they're for humans, they're for the benefit of humans, and they focus on not just having the AI do things, but doing things that will benefit people. And so that's really interesting that we have a note here that I believe you wrote about like how AI is not going to change how we learn and grow, but it can examine things based on the data that we give it, and we are in charge of that interaction. And so I also wrote another blog post because I was in a writing mood these past few weeks, apparently, called Human Machine Interactions Lead to Human Machine Products. And I've really been focusing a little bit on, the human. I joined the human intelligence movement, and there's a blurb in there on the first part about that as well. But the most successful implementations, despite the overpromising, like the ones that you're talking about, are ones that the human is in charge and the human is in control. Um, the user takes responsibility for it. And that's another one of our framework principles, if we want to discuss those a little bit more. But it seems like, yeah, we have a really good job of framing these around the framework principles. And the last one, where you are ultimately responsible, kind of really, really is is evident in the conversation about AI over promises. So
Yeah.
this has
So
been really good.
I think the short answer for both of us is, yeah, it's still an amazing technology.
Mhm.
It's been, it's been being hyped, and for obvious reasons, because of the promise and the fundraising and the like. But I do think it is an amazing technology, and it's fraught with uh, potentially problematic areas. But my
Uh,
own personal use, if my own personal use is an indicator, it is an amazing intellectual tool.
yeah, absolutely.
Good place to stop.
Yeah, no, that's really good. That's really good. This has been really productive. This is awesome. Yeah,
Thank you, Reed.
a lot of thoughts. Thank you. See you next week.
See you next week.